Hi everyone, this is Jamie and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Okay, on today's episode, I think I'm going to start with a little bit of a recap of the last episode I did, and then today I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects of yoga practice and specifically in the Ashtanga yoga system around some things that we see as inherent truths and practices that surround the Ashtanga system, such as moon days. We're going to talk a little bit about today, and 6 days a week practice, doing the full series, some things like this that I think some students might have maybe the wrong impression of, and how we can approach these things in a way that we feel is more integrated into our own personal practice, and maybe a little bit about where they come from and understanding the origin of some of these aspects of yoga practice so that we understand a little bit more fully. But let's just start with a bit of a recap on last week. So there's been a bit of an explosion and a lot of energy now that's being driven into, I would say, talking about some truths within the yoga world, and obviously in particular within the Ashtanga yoga world, which I think is a positive thing. And I'll give a little bit of, I didn't talk about this on last week's episode. It just didn't naturally come up. So I'm going to just talk about that a little bit today and how I think this started actually, because I think it's a little bit interesting how things become popular, or you could say that some things start to become a trend. And as you know from people who listen to this podcast, I'm very much interested in open dialogue and the truth. I think, spiritual practices and the practice of yoga should be a quest for reality and truth, and that happens from open discourse. So what I've seen happen lately and in this last week is a big energetic shift towards more truth, and I'm totally for this. Yeah, I think that, as I usually say, the truth generally leads to good things, even if it means going through an uncomfortable period and something that can feel like a difficult thing to confront. Generally, the truth leads to good things. I'm not really into avoidance and covering things up or lying about things and hiding things. These generally don't lead to positive things. So the truth coming out is a good thing. It kind of gets exposed and cleared. And I think there's a shift towards that at the moment, which I'm very much in favor of. I think that what I've seen mostly on the internet around the controversy around certain practitioners in Ashtanga yoga is definitely more of a vibe towards truth. But I also see a lot of people sort of piggybacking really on something that could be sort of seen as, signaling in some kind of virtue. And I think that what's a little bit sad about this, not to be negative about it, but I think inherently it's generally positive, what I see, is that it's just that really this didn't get talked about earlier, and that, correct yogic and spiritual practices shouldn't be just about what's popular. Yeah, at the moment, transparency and truth is becoming a bit more popular, we could say. And you could say that that's kind of trending, you could say, in some way. And it's a popular thing to talk about because that's trending. And I think that that's good, because it means that more energy is being shifted towards transparency and truth. But really, these things should have been talked about before, and there should have been transparency from the get-go. So again, I'm not being really negative about it. It's more just highlighting that yogic practices and spiritual practices shouldn't be about what's popular. and what's trending. And I think that it's interesting to kind of observe that. And like I say, it's really nice to hear people who suffered from abuse and systematic problems within Ashtanga yoga really coming to light and highlighting those things. I think that it would be nice to just it would be nice to have that as normal rather than just what's popular and what's trending. But I think what's interesting a little bit about this is to actually think about where this came from. These problems have been sort of systemic within yogic traditions for a while, I would say, as I've talked about in the previous episode, so I won't go into that too much. And I think that sometimes these things happen because there is a shift energetically and things change. And I think that's what's happened. And I think that this is something I've been kind of, what's the word? Not pushing, but maybe a little bit, kind of, I've been more interested in that side of things and things coming out and being transparent. And I would say over the last year or so, I don't really interact too much with forums and social media in that way. I don't really get into debates or conversations with people online. I don't find it very elevating in any way. These places can be good, but I think sometimes it can lead to some negative energy. But I think these forums are a very good space for people to connect, especially from people in different countries who might not know each other, and to kind of share ideas and experiences. And I think that this is a positive thing. And like I say, what I mostly saw was these places being shut down and conversation being controlled. And I really dislike that. I really dislike controlling stories. And what got really exposed, like I said last time, was that lots of yoga forums posts were being deleted, comments were being deleted. And what got exposed was that specific teachers were threatening these spaces with legal action. So this is all very bad behavior around trying to control stories so that certain information doesn't come out. And I think that the people that run these or moderate these groups really need to take some accountability there, because it's not good to shut down conversation like this and to limit what people can talk about. And I did a few experiments over the last year just out of personal interest to see what topics weren't allowed to be talked about. And what I observed was that there are certain topics within yoga and Ashtanga yoga that are very much, not approved of and are specifically shut down. And I think that this is what I would like to see change, is that there's more open and transparent conversations around things so that people feel more free to discuss things that they like and dislike. And I think that leads to positive things. So as an experiment, over the last year, I posed a few questions in different forums just to see how people would respond. And like I say, I observed certain places just shut down, conversations deleted. It was very much a controlling space. And I observed this and I thought, wow, this is very strange actually. What a kind of odd way to respond to open discourse that isn't hateful or calling out anyone particular, but just, a general conversation around things. And it really highlighted what has really been intrinsic in Ashtanga yoga and yogic traditions, that, the bad things kind of get hidden. They get kind of pushed to the side. And there's this energy of, kind of hiding things and not letting things come out. And then, as with most of these things, it just comes out much later in a worse way. And I think that's what's happened lately. So, I posed a few of these questions and I saw this energy and I just thought, I'm just not going to engage with these spaces. It's sad really, because these, public forums and things should be a good place for people to connect and share ideas and things like that. Even if it means that, these might not be very popular, or that they might be difficult to talk about, or even, painful to read, but that's okay. Like I say, it's good to talk about things and not to hide things. So it's kind of interesting. My girlfriend was like around this and observing this, and she's kind of approaches these things in a different way. And I thought this was a bit of an interesting take. And she kind of posted a meme on one of these forums just to highlight the fact that, moderators and that were deleting and shutting these things down. And that meme went a bit viral. And it was a bit funny because I think this was one of the things that kick-started this shift a bit lately. It's interesting where things come from. And the intention around this meme and the intention of these conversations from my part and my girlfriend's part was a positive one. It was really just saying, hey, it's not good to control conversations. It's not good to delete things and shut things down because you don't like the topic. Yeah, this doesn't lead to positive change. And I think from that, and obviously from some other things that have been going on lately, this created this energy of really trying to expose things that have been going on. And this has been highlighted by this 1% truth. And lots of other people now have kind of talked about this, and, senior teachers and lots of different people who've had negative experiences in yoga. And like I say, I generally feel this leads to positive change. So I think that there is a shift at the moment more towards truth and more towards transparency. And I think that I would very much like that to continue. So my recap from this is to say that this, you can feel it, yeah? When things become clearer and things become more truthful, things feel lighter, yeah? They feel less heavy and they feel more clear. And this is what we want from yogic practices, yeah? This is why I was highlighting these things, and I have been, for many months or years really, around the way to approach yogic practices. The intention around these practices should be towards truth and transparency, and not with lying and deception and controlling things. This doesn't lead to anything positive. So it's nice to see that shift. And like I say, I would like that this just isn't some new virtue to signal, that now this is popular, it's okay to talk about it, because really that's how these things happen, yeah? When some things that are going on are bad and they're potentially abusive and potentially harming, avoiding that and avoiding confrontation and shutting down conversations about those things does not lead to anything good. And lately is 100% proof of that, yeah? We need to allow these conversations to happen, even if they're very difficult, yeah? Even if people get triggered, even if it leads to people losing money or popularity or whatever it might be, because underneath all that is the altruistic goals of yoga. And I think that shift seems to be happening at the moment. And again, I'm very much for that. I digress. So just a brief recap. But on today's episode, let's start with moon days. Actually, this is a good one to start with, and actually, this is what I was supposed to do before a lot of this came about. But I'm going to talk about some things that we could say are traditional in yoga and Ashtanga yoga, and we could say that are largely based on a kind of belief system. And we could say that parts of this you could say are traditional, and I'm going to talk about where they come from, and why it's good to question things actually, because lots of things get passed down through traditions, lots of things get kind of proposed to us and suggested to us as good things to do, and I think sometimes we can take that on board very trustingly, which is not a bad thing. But in my experience of life, in my nature as a person, I am generally someone that tends to try something myself and kind of prove it to myself before I fully embody it. Yeah, it's nice to hear traditions and myths, and it's nice to kind of someone suggest things that we try and tell us as if those are facts. But my nature is to question things. So pretty much everything in the Ashtanga system I've questioned at some point, and I've experimented to see whether that's true. And I've done that in my own teaching style, and I do that in my teaching style with my students, because I'm very aware of sort of dogmatism and really untruths becoming true because of a belief. Now, we have to be a little bit careful with this, because the mind is a very powerful thing, yeah? Sometimes we can believe something so strongly that it almost becomes true. Yeah, again, the mind is a very powerful thing. So we might take on a truth that's not actually ours, and it becomes something that we do that might not even be right for us. And like I say, some of these things can be very positive. Some traditions can be really nice, but we have to be a little bit careful of how much we stop being critical and how much we kind of start becoming a believer. And to believe in something is very different to having experienced it yourself. I am a believer of both. Yeah, I believe that it's good to believe in things and to trust things, but it's also good to remain critical, and it's good to practice things based on your experience. So what I've done with the Ashtanga system, for example, is question pretty much everything, and I've experimented with almost every aspect of it, I would say, and then I've tried to embody and practice the things that I feel are right for me based on my experience. And I also teach from that place, so that for me, I feel very much connected to my own yoga practice, and I feel very much connected to how I teach it based on the experience I've had. This to me, as I've talked about in previous episodes, is natural, and I think this is a natural thing for teachers to do rather than dogmatically push things, even though we're not really sure if those things are really true, or we haven't even tested whether they're true or not. Yeah. Let's start with moon days, for example. So when we start a new hobby or a certain practice, lots of the times we can start those things from a different culture. I've done this with different martial arts, for example, from Japan and Brazil, places like that, and it's great. We learn a lot about our new culture when we take these things on. Different languages, with Japanese, Portuguese, with Sanskrit, for example, and this has a certain feeling to it, and it's nice. It's exciting. We get to learn about new traditions, cultures, and I've always loved that about learning practices and hobbies from different cultures. You really get to learn about different societies and the way people live. And obviously in yogic traditions, this is very a strong thing, yeah? This goes back thousands of years, with lots of history, lots of traditions, and lots of belief systems that, have maintained through the years. And some have evolved, some of these traditions have been evolving and changing, and different teachers evolve and change these traditions based on their value system. And again, I think that's right, yeah? I would not want to practice with a teacher who was dogmatically pushing something that they didn't really believe in. I think we're all drawn to teachers that are passionate about what they do and that they believe in what they do. And I'm drawn to teachers like that. The moon days are interesting, for example, because, where did this really come from? So in Ashtanga, the tradition is that you don't really practice yoga or Ashtanga yoga, for example, on moon days. So this would be, twice in the month in the lunar phase, where we have a full moon and we have a new moon. Now, there's lots of different theories on this, and there's lots of different science, you could say, around this, but I would say it mostly comes from the Joyce family as a tradition. Now, lots of people have written different theories about this, and my own take on it, really, and I've experimented with this a lot, is that it is mostly a tradition that comes from the Joyce family. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just good to understand where this comes from and, why this might be the case. Now, when I first started practicing Ashtanga, the lunar phases were something that was spoken about quite a lot by senior teachers that came from Mysore and practicing with Pattabhi Jois. And this was seen as a very strict observation, is the idea that you do not practice on these days. The mythology, we could say, or the theory around it, is that when we kind of get to the full moon, around this time, we could say that in tradition, there's more of a pranic energy. So at the end of the inhalation, there's this upward energy that in you could say this potentially some of this comes from the Upanishads in some way, that there is this upward energy on the pranic inhale that can make us more headstrong or give us too much forceful input into our yoga practices. And the idea that is this relates to the energetic shift of the lunar phase with, the distance between the moon and the earth. Now, I'll go a little bit more into the science a little bit later, so let me just stick with the theory. And around the new moon, it's the opposite. It's more of this aponic force, this downward energy, where we might be feeling more tired or heavy. And again, both of these periods are associated in some way that some type of injury might occur or something negative might happen within your yoga practice. Now, I will say categorically, I know at least a couple of teachers, Ashtanga teachers, senior teachers, who I totally respect massively, who adhere to this. And I would say that upon having conversations with them, they would say that they feel very differently in their body around those times. Now, this is their felt experience, and I completely respect that. I'm sure for some people, this potentially is something that you feel in your body, and maybe there is a connection there that you sense and you feel, and it feels good for you to adhere to that tradition. And it's also something that you observe in your body. This is something that can be true. Yeah. So for people that feel that and sense that and they experience that, and it also is in line with them to follow that tradition, then that's something those people obviously practice. And I respect people who connect with it in that way, and that can be true for people. Yeah. My experience of this was not. Yeah. So I question this just because it's in my nature to question these things. Because, from a felt experience, I didn't really notice any different. So for about a year, I experimented with this. So from my own practice those days, I didn't really feel any different. And I would also say that from practicing on moon days, it didn't really match the theory in Indian tradition around how you might feel at different phases of the lunar cycle, right? And my nature is I don't like being afraid of things. My nature is to question things that can bring up some sort of fear. And I never liked the idea that I had some kind of fear energy around something bad happening. It felt very superstitious. And, we all grew up with different superstitions. And I never really liked that. My mum was a little bit superstitious actually with some things. And the things I grew up with, like walking under ladders and things like this, I questioned all of those. And I purposely did those to kind of prove to myself that I didn't like feeling restricted, like I couldn't do things. I was more interested in, let's see if that actually works. So I would, walk under ladders, break glass, window, mirrors. It's like I wanted to question those things a little bit. And it's in my nature to do that. So I did this with the moon sequence, the moon days. And, from practice, I didn't really feel any different. And I kind of really just forgot about it. And then I would just got into a phase of, like I do actually. I'll get into this a little bit later around how often we should practice. But in terms of the lunar phases, I didn't really feel any different. And when I started to go into the history of where this came from, it also, really validated my own feeling around this, that it really seemed to come from the Joyce family. Now, astrology and adhering to different phases of the lunar cycle definitely comes from Indian astrology. And I would say that the Joyce family were very much, practicing Brahmins, and their practices around following the lunar phases would very much be in line with Indian astrology. So it made sense for me that Pattabhi Jois and his family would be people that would follow that and would be in sync with that, because it's part of the Brahmic traditions of following the lunar phases, where on moon days, they do lots of different rituals and rites, and you could see how that could be in conflict with practicing Ashtanga yoga, and also with family commitments that, 2 days a month you took time off of practice and you put your energy into your Brahmic traditions, which would happen on those lunar phase days. So, for Pattabhi Jois, I'm sure that was something that was very relevant for him, his family. And so he taught that in that way. It was important to him. It was important to his practices. And most teachers will do that. In any type of teaching, they tend to emphasize the things that they think are important and were important to him. But what I mostly saw was Pattabhi Jois and the Jois family passing on traditions that were important to them and weren't necessarily embodied within yogic traditions in general. If I look at the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, or even, let's think about different texts. There's some slight mention of this in the Upanishads around where prana is stored in the head and being a little bit headstrong. But when I think about different traditions and I think about different texts, really, where did modern day yoga come from? When we think about modern day yoga, we think mostly about Krishnamacharya. So when we think about his main book, the Makaranda, there's no mention of moon days at all within that text. I don't think Krishnamacharya adhered to moon days or didn't practice on moon days. And when I look at Srivatsa Ramaswamy, who was a student of Krishnamacharya for, I think, around 30 years, I heard no mention of them not practicing on moon days. So for someone that studied with Krishnamacharya for 3 decades, his teaching was not to adhere to any kind of moon day traditions or lunar phase traditions. And again, it's not really mentioned anywhere in the Yoga Sutras or, again, any Hatha Yoga texts around not practicing on moon days. But it's definitely a thing within Brahmic traditions, which again would make sense for Pattabhi Jois. So I think from my own personal study of this, it really felt to me not specifically a yogic tradition. It's definitely an Indian astrology thing, and definitely a Brahmic thing, which made sense, from Pattabhi Jois as a teacher. And why I'm saying this is important is because these aren't, sacred things from thousands of years ago that can't be changed. This is one person's belief around what felt right for him, what he embodied, and what he taught. And that's correct. I think that's totally correct. I would be drawn to someone like that was embodied in the sense of what they believed was right for them and they taught it that way. For him, that was correct. But we can't just, pass that on as a fact and that this is the same for everybody and that everyone should adhere to this. We should be able to kind of critique these things and embody the things that feel right for us, especially as teachers. Otherwise, we're just passing on dogma. Yeah, I talk a lot about that on this podcast around dogmatism. Yeah, we have to be a little bit mindful of the things that we repeat and what we tell other people as facts, when actually most of this is some form of a belief system. It's fine, it's fine that people believe things. It's fine that this could be a tradition, but we can't really look at this as some sort of inherent fact that is infallible and that we can't question, because moon days is definitely one that we can question. Now, the science behind this, as a Westerner, I don't think it actually helps that much going into the science of things. We can get a little bit too much in our head. I would much more rather sense of what that feels like. And the reason I mostly dropped the moon day thing was around how it felt. But if you do look at the science of it, it also doesn't really add up too much. If you look at the lunar phases of the moon, if we think about the distance between the Earth and the moon, if we think about the mass of the Earth and the moon, it doesn't really change. The distance changes. The distance can change, and therefore the gravitational force can change between the Earth and the moon. How much that affects your body is negligible. Yeah, I mean, even the timing of it. If we think about perigee and apogee, so these are the kind of the shortest distance and the longest distance between the moon and the earth. These don't really match the lunar phases of the new moon and the full moon. So perigee and apogee can occur at different times of the month, at different phases of the lunar cycle. So they don't really match what's purported in certain from certain teachers and certain spaces, that this is inherently linked to the lunar phase of of the moon cycle. So again, to me, this is there's definitely some holes in this that doesn't really ring true. And if we think about the human body largely encompassing water, how much would that actually change between the different cycles of the lunar phase in terms of how much gravitational force is imposed on our body? Someone else I know who wrote this, which I kind of thought was quite funny, that potentially, a mosquito landing on your body could have more gravitational force as opposed to the changing of the lunar phases. So it's very much one that you can debate and question. I think what's more relevant really is how you feel. And again, I think it's good to experiment and to see how you feel, what you might feel like on those days. And for me, this was something that something I didn't really feel any difference from. I think it's interesting to think about it from a yogic perspective in terms of the inhalation and the exhalation, and if you think about different forces and how that might affect your body. But I don't really feel how that is really at all linked to the different lunar phases around the calendar month. Again, experiment, see what feels right for you, see what feels good. At my shala, I don't close on moon days. I kind of dropped that a while ago. And again, it wouldn't feel right teaching it that way, because it would be, my life would be a little bit easier. I would have 2 extra rest days a month. I wouldn't have to teach, but it didn't really feel right for me to do it. Because if I practice on those days and I tell my students not to, it feels a bit fake. And that's not really my kind of energy. I need to kind of share things that I feel I'm in line with. And the moon day thing, I didn't really feel so connected to. And again, from experimentation, it didn't really make sense. I mean, it's an interesting thing to observe. And I think that also depends where you live. Norway's a bit of a funny one. I live in Norway because the summer days are so long and the winter days are so short. And I live in Oslo, which is a small city. So, with street lights and, the general night sky being very limited in terms of what you can see, there's a disconnect there also, and I think this can be also part of it. I think if you live in nature and you maybe even work in nature, you are potentially more connected to the different phases of the lunar cycle. And that could be something that you feel more strongly connected to based on the fact that you're more in contact with it, something that you observe more. So I think that this could also be true. It's very much a nature thing. When I've lived in other parts of the world, I felt much more in sync with nature. For example, when I lived more on the equator, I was much more in sync, I felt, with the sun and the moon in some ways. So I think that can be something you sense and that you feel depending on where you live. So I think it's much harder to do that when you live in a city, for example, and modern day living, where we're much more disembodied and disconnected from nature in that way. So there's no right or wrong here. I think it's interesting to talk about and to see what you sense and you feel in your body. But I think as a dogmatic kind of rule, I would question that. And I think that it would be good to question even where it came from. Like I say, it doesn't really follow so far back in yogic traditions. And again, what are yogic traditions? They're interpretations of everyone's interpretation of something before them. Things evolve, things change, they're not set in stone, and that's a positive thing. And each teacher has that kind of evolution in their practice and their teaching ability. And again, how many things through history are repeated dogmatically because it was important thousands of years ago, potentially. You know, something that was important maybe 1,000 years ago is not really so important now, and maybe we've learned from that and evolved from that so that we don't have to just repeat dogmatic statements that aren't really maybe even true anymore. Yeah, we have to kind of drop, in my opinion, this idea of things being infallible or sacred in some way. Yeah, they're all up for debate. These things are all up for debate depending on your experience and on the idea that things evolve. What I'm mostly interested in is intention. The intention of something matters more than the thing itself. This is why I practice the Ashtanga Yoga system, because I feel the intention with it is good. Yeah, there's a good intention with it. I've talked about this before on other episodes. If the intention is kind of pure and good, and you feel that when you're doing it, in a way this can be more important. So maybe adhering to the Moon Day tradition, if the intention behind that feels good, and you feel a good energy with it, and a love energy, then I think you should practice that. That's something that I would say that's more important in a way, yeah? But if you're doing it just out of rigidness or anything other than that, then I think it's up for debate and to question it. But personally, I'm more up for being in sync with my body than being in sync with someone else's belief system. I'll go into this a little bit more with practice days and things like that. My goal with yoga and teaching yoga really is to build intuition. Yeah, we live very disembodied these days with modern day living, especially phone culture, city life, buildings, straight lines, a disconnect from nature, a disconnect from life and death, the natural things that happen. This is becoming even more so. Yoga is an embodied practice that brings you back to your intuition. Your intuition builds trust in your own feeling towards something that feels right for you. I'm more in line with cultivating that rather than doing something dogmatically. Lots of people think that the Ashtanga Yoga system is this like rigid dogmatic thing, but it depends how you practice it, yeah? It depends how your intention is with it, which is why I'm not drawn to super rigid, strict teachers that do things in a dogmatic way, because it doesn't really mean much to me if someone's just repeating something like parrot-like, unless they've embodied it themselves and their intention is coming from a felt experience that feels right. I don't like it when someone's just repeating something out of dogmatism without really knowing the difference. To me, this is not something I really connect with. This is why I think a lot of people were drawn to Pattabhi Jois. He was passionate about his belief systems and what he felt was right for him, and that had a certain energy to it, yeah? Maybe I would have felt the same. But I think that as teachers, we need to evolve a little bit and think about what feels right for us, specifically as teachers, so that when we pass things on, we feel that it's coming from an embodied place. And again, we're not just repeating things from someone else's belief system. Yeah, it should be something that we embody ourselves, and that embodiment gets passed on to our students as something that feels right. You know, I've questioned other aspects of this in yoga. So, you know, another thing is in Ashtanga Yoga is, you know, practicing 6 days a week. Now, I'm a very physical guy. I like moving my body. And even if I didn't do Ashtanga Yoga, I would move my body every day pretty much in some way. I'm a believer in movement. I think movement heals, is good for the brain. And it's something that's becoming a problem in modern day living, where people aren't moving enough, or they're just doing high intensity cardio work and then sitting for many hours a day, and there's this imbalance. I talked about this on many a podcast before. I'm a believer in movement. Movement heals. It's natural, yeah? It's natural to move a lot as a human. It's natural to move like every other species on this planet that moves very often in very varied ways throughout the day. This to me is natural rather than the modern day living, which I would say is more unnatural, where we become disembodied. We lose a connection to our body. We're in very disembodied buildings, straight lines, disconnected from nature. this is where things, in my opinion, start to become a problem. People become more sick and they become disconnected from that intuition, which is what yoga, in my opinion, fixes, which is also why modern day living requires a practice like yoga. I've said it before, maybe if you work in nature, with the earth, something you're more embodied in that way, maybe you wouldn't need a yogic practice so much. But I think for a lot of modern day living, I would say that this is essential, yeah? So 6 days a week, where did that come from? Again, I would say this is another thing from the Joyce family and Pattabhi Joyce. And again, this was probably relevant for himself as a practitioner to practice this often. And remember, a lot of these yogic practices in the very physical form were originally designed for young boys. So just keep that in mind around energy levels and how much we should move and the intensity of movement. Think about what they were originally designed for prior to that. It was to heal people, not necessarily doing advanced asana to perform at the Mysore Palace. So just keep that in mind, yeah? The intention can be different, yeah? Learning performative asana is one thing. Progressing through the series in a holistic way is another thing. And healing people is also another thing. So we have to think about the intention of these practices. I've said enough on this before, so I won't necessarily go into that today. But 6 days a week, this definitely can be too much for a lot of people, yeah? I would not rigidly, dogmatically tell people you have to practice 6 days a week. You have to practice primary series at the end of the week. There's a lot of rules around which days you should do different series, different asana, and which days you should take rest. My personal feeling is this. I practiced this way from the beginning, yeah? So I tried to embody that belief system that you should do it 6 days a week, take 1 day rest. So I started that way, yeah? And you could say that I've always practiced that way. I actually practice nearly every day. I take a rest day occasionally. When I take a rest day, it's based on how I feel intuitively. Yeah, it's not based around which day of the week, and it's not based around what someone else might feel is right for me. It's an intuitive thing. When I feel I need a rest day, I take a rest day. Days I want to practice, I practice. Now for me, that's pretty much every day. For me, I will practice some form of movement every day. I will practice the Ashtanga yoga system pretty much every day. This is what feels right for me and what I like to explore. I'm very much interested in exploring the depths of the Ashtanga yoga system and the mirror that gives you on a daily basis. This has definitely helped me bring truth, intuition, strength and flexibility into my life. This is something that I get a lot from, even on the difficult days, which is why a lot of teachers will push this, because they feel that a student is going to benefit the most from practicing often. I would say that people benefit more from practicing yoga more often than not. How much you do is really up to your constitution and how much energy you have. Lots of us have families, modern day life, jobs, things that take our energy away from us, that also affects how often we can practice and how much we can practice. What I recommend to students is just to try and find that balance, yeah? I'm not really into telling people what to do. I think that it's not the best energy, this top-down approach. And as I've said on previous episodes, I'm really against this sort of top-down authoritarian sort of energy that I would say is largely practiced by Ashtanga yoga teachers. And I think sometimes the intention can be good, but really I think what leads to the best result is when students can find that a little bit naturally themselves, and there's a little bit more leeway around some of these traditions where it's not something that they feel guilt or shame about. Yeah, I mean, guilt and shame It's not something that should be associated to yoga practice in any way, shape, or form. Like I say, I do believe that you will benefit more from practicing yoga often. And, you know, like for example, my own practice, the days where, I'm tired or this, that, and the other, I will generally do some sun salutations and some standing postures and a few finishing poses because it just feels good. Even on a tired day, just doing the standing postures in the stand just feels good. Even if I'm stiff, tired, even if I'm sick, actually, I'll do some sort of movement, because I feel better from it. I think what kind of puts some students off is that they feel they need to come in and do this whole 2-hour series or, primary series and drop backs. And that can be a little bit daunting and overwhelming. And they get into this kind of performative aspect that they need to do everything. And I would recommend you drop that like a stone. It doesn't really benefit you from just exhausting yourself too much. It's better you practice more often, I would say, and just don't do so much. I know some practitioners that are more all or nothing people, so they might take days off and then just come in and do the full series, and that works for them. But I would generally say what works best, in my experience, is less and more often. It's so nice to come to the Mysore room. It's quiet, it's calm, and just do a little bit. It just feels good. And let go of the going deeper, progressing through the series, this whole chasing element that can occur in Ashtanga yoga practitioners, and just do really slow, lovely sun salutations. Like I've heard Richard Freeman describe very eloquently all of the things that we can embody from just doing Surya Namaskar A. There's a lot going on there, just doing that, doing some sun salutes and, a few finishing postures can be really nice. Get into the breath, being embodied, being present, breathing, moving, and, starting your day in a positive way. A lot of this is about intention, Again, the morning practice thing, what's that about? Really, how do you start your day? If you're doom scrolling on your phone or... especially for people with depression, I've been through some periods of my life where that's been a problem. It's been very difficult. And my yoga practice has really helped in those periods, I've had students that have the same, and people I've met in the past, it's very difficult to get up in the morning and do something if you're in a kind of depressed state. And when you lose, what's the best way of wording this? When you don't have a routine or you don't have something that's a little bit more of a constant in your life, it's very easy to drop those things, I talked about this on practitioners stopping yoga. It can be very hard to start again. But when it's something that's just a little bit more of a normal thing you do and a regular thing you do, maybe even a daily thing you do, it's much easier to maintain. And again, being in a calm space, breathing and moving should be, in my opinion, more or less a daily thing. I think most of us need that on a daily basis, I would say. I would say majority of people need a space to go to that's quiet and calm, where you can move and breathe without judgment and shame on a daily basis. If you think about it like that, that would be a good daily thing to do. Maybe you don't need to do so much. Maybe you don't need to do so much asana, but just that energy and that intention is life-changing. And I'm saying that from experience. I've had a lot of really... Maybe I've talked about that on some episodes. I don't know if I'll ever go into a lot of details about that, but I've been in some super fucking dark periods of my life. And yoga has helped me massively. It's just been that constant thing there, that it's been... what's the best way to word this? My mat, this is going to sound very cliche, but having a space in my home or a shala to go to and my mat to go to, as I don't want to use the word saved, but it's been a constant, that's been a constant in my life for many years. And I've needed that. It's almost been like an anchor, where it doesn't matter what's going on in my life. It could be really dark, and at periods it's been like that. And my mat has been a place to go to. Yeah, it's like this safe space. I can go to my mat and just be, me, without any other pressure, without any other imposing thing on me. It's just a very sacred, personal space for me. And over the years, I've come to love that. Yeah, I've really come to love that I have that in my life. I'm so grateful. And, really, you could say the opening mantra for Ashtanga is about this. It's about being grateful for the people that have taught you the system and for the people that have helped you learn this thing. And I really embody that, is that that's something I will always have in my life. And I'm very grateful that I've cultivated that. And I've practiced with good teachers that have helped cultivate that. That I always have that there, yeah? Whatever's going on, whenever I've needed help or whenever I've needed space for myself, my mat's always kind of been there. And that sacred space for me has always been there. And I've helped cultivate that for myself. It's a very personal, loving thing. And if you can create that energy with your yoga practice, it can be life-changing. So I think teachers have good intentions with, 6 days a week, and that is just how it's done. It's too authoritarian most of the time, in my opinion, and it's too top-down and authoritative. I think naturally, in my experience of watching students, is that they come to appreciate it. They come to appreciate the nature of the room. They come to appreciate what they have. They come to appreciate that there's this space that they can go to outside of family commitments and children and work and mortgages and all the other shit that's going on in your life. And there's this space where you can just be, that's very creative. It builds a lot of intuition, and there's no pressure. And that's what I think a good room should be like. There's not pressure. You can just be yourself there. I don't really, in a way, I don't care how much of the series my students practice, or how, it's more around the intention that they come with. Yeah, it's great when we're strong and flexible and we're flying through the series and learning lots of new asana, and there's periods that are like that. But, there's lots of periods that aren't. And, the most grateful periods I've had with my yoga practice is when it's been hard, yeah. And I'm just grateful to go somewhere and have that kind of calm energy, especially if you're someone who has a lot of chaos in your life, or maybe some difficult things. You need that space. Everyone needs that space. It's sacred, like I say. And starting your day in that way, this is why morning practice is so good, just sets that vibe, yeah? It sets that intention for your day that's positive. You go somewhere where you're seen, you're heard, teacher cares about you, yeah? A good teacher will, and they care about your yoga practice. And you feel that energy in the room where you're seen, you're heard, you're cared for, and it's a safe space. You can be how you want to be, and you start your day like that. Yeah, it's very different when you've had a full day of family, stress, work, and that takes its toll. And then, maybe your yoga practice will feel good from that, but it's very different to how you start your day. I don't think one is better than the other. It's just that they have a different vibe. Yeah, I know people that practice in the evening and, put it in where you can. Again, no pressure, just as you can when you can, but they do feel different. For me, get up, have a coffee, go to the shala, bang. That's gold. Starting your day that way for me is gold dust. But I don't really like the authoritative top-down pushing of that. And I've heard about this with teachers just ringing up their students, harassing them where they are and pushing them to go and guilt tripping them to go. I mean, it's just like neg energy. I don't think that's good. People don't need more guilt, pressure, shame in their life. It's just talk about the positives of it. I feel like that, encourage the positives of practice, and then people will choose what they want to do. The shala's there, the teacher's there, promote the positives of it. I talk about that all the time on this podcast. Let people choose for themselves. It's got a much better, I think people tend to practice longer as well when they have that energy, rather than feel like they're being pushed and shamed into doing stuff. It's like, again, drop that. It doesn't help people, in my opinion. But yeah, and again, especially if you're someone who suffers from depression, that's a big one. I mean, that can be a real, with depression, we succumb to the things that we shouldn't do, like procrastinate and avoid and, retreat. We know that moving and breathing and going somewhere will help, but the way to instigate that just doesn't happen. And I know because I've been there, and that's what I'm saying. If you do have that constant, if you do have that thing there that you have as a regular thing, it's much easier to maintain that. So if you're someone that struggles in that way and struggles with a little bit of discipline, thinking about it in that way can help a lot. I've not really been someone that struggles with discipline, but even when I've been, depressed or worse, I generally will fight to find that motivation to move and do something just because I know it will feel better. And just getting to your mat can be enough, yeah. But where you go from there can change from day to day. But if you're really someone who struggles with mental health in that way, just trying to have a consistent sort of thing you do, a bit like brushing your teeth. If you kind of think about it like that, then it can become something that is easier to maintain. I'm saying this because I care, it's like I've seen a lot of people struggle with that, but it's finding that balance. Some of us can be too disciplined in a way and too regimented. Those people need a little bit more spontaneity and looseness, not being so hard on themselves, not pushing so hard. Some of us need a little bit more discipline and a little bit more, you could say, structure in our life that will make us happier. And it's trying to find that balance. And we're all a little bit different like that. We have to find what feels right for us. But yeah, and the embodiment thing, this is to me the largest part about it, is just, it's so easy to be disembodied in modern day life. If you go for a walk in nature, or you're out in mountains or in a jungle, maybe you're even on a boat in the ocean, you're so embodied more so in what you're doing. You're more connected to, life. You're more connected to the wind, the sun, everything. You're more connected to nature, so you're more embodied in that way. And we need that in our life. We really, really do need that in our life. We need that embodied. We need embodied practices. Yeah, I would say people are becoming much more disembodied, especially with phone culture and again modern day living. So knowing when something's true, or knowing, trusting our intuition, is what you're going to get from your yoga practice. And I've talked about this on many episodes before, but that's why having a regular yoga practice will be life-changing, even if it's a little bit difficult. Yeah, I would say you learn a lot from practicing on your difficult days. You learn a lot from practicing on the days you're tired. You learn a lot from the days you don't want to go. And this is the thing that people struggle with. How do you know when you're doing too much or forcing yourself to doing something, as opposed to, being dogmatic? I know a lot of students struggle with this. Yeah, I would say what you need to do is experiment. Say for like a year or 6 months, say to yourself, I'm going to go 5 or 6 days a week and I'm going to see what that feels like. And I'm going to try to embody that. And see what it feels like. Don't do everything. Don't do so much. The days you're tired, just slow down. Breathe longer. Do less of the series. See how that feels. But getting up, going to the shala, see how that feels doing it on a more regular basis. See how that affects your life. See how it affects your decision making. See how that affects your relationships. Does it reflect? Does it make a positive change? Or is it having a negative effect? You have to experiment, yeah? I did this for years. I experimented. I said to myself, right, okay, 6 days a week, I'm going to do that for like a few years and see. I'm going to experiment. I've done this with other hobbies and other practices. Okay, I'm going to do that for X amount of time and see what it feels like. I'm going to trust what I'm being told. And from doing that, I felt like, yeah, this is having a really positive effect on my life. I'm going to keep doing that. You have to find that balance and you have to find that way of experimentation. But I would say to experiment, you have to try. You have to see what that feels like, yeah? If you're a family person with kids and this stuff, if you maybe 3 days a week works for you, maybe that's just the right amount. Or maybe you do a couple of days a week where you're able to do like a full practice and that feels really energizing and good. But maybe another couple of days of the week you come in and you just do some standing postures and you meditate for half an hour. I don't know. You have to find that balance. Your teacher will help you find that balance, but a lot of it is about experimenting too, which is why we don't need to dogmatically tell someone you have to do the whole series, you have to do this, you have to do that. You won't become more spiritually awakened by forcing or guilt shaming yourself into doing more asana. It's more about finding that right balance. So we need to drop that a little bit in Ashtanga yoga with all this like authoritative teachers telling you what you have to do. A good thing to ask your teacher is, right, do you have a family? Do you have a full-time job? And are you able to practice a full series every day doing that? I would say that, a lot of Ashtanga teachers, for example, don't have that. They don't have full-time jobs and they don't have families, So we have to be compassionate, I've worked full-time in engineering for many years. I know what it's like to balance these things. You have to do it from a place of experience. You have to see what your students are like, with their kids, their family. There has to be a balance, It's all well and good someone telling you what they should do, but have they lived that way? Do they know what that's like? It's not good to force people and shame people into doing things. It has to feel right, But my experience is that if you like me moving and breathing and you feel it's a good way to start your day, try to do that as often as you can. I'm sure your husband or your wife will notice the positives in that. And if you're in a good relationship, they'll probably encourage that and know that that's a good thing in your life, and that maybe that makes you a better mother or a father, and that you have more capacity for your family by having, a regular yoga practice. Most people I know that have a regular yoga practice talk about the benefits that it has in their job, their love life, everything. It's generally a positive thing. But if it's to the detriment of those things, that it has to be in balance. We can't all dedicate so much time to yoga, which is why we want to learn from yoga teachers, people that have, I changed my whole life to fully to put as much energy into this as I have, which is why you need people like that to teach it. You don't really want a hobbyist potentially teaching you the deeper aspects of yoga. We do need people that have fully gone into it at a deep level. That's the kind of people I want to learn from, and the people that we want to learn these practices from. But it doesn't mean we all need to just do that. It doesn't even mean you won't get the same benefit. It's about that balance. You need to find that balance in your life where you feel that it's adding value to your life and not taking it away. And then going back really to the topic of this podcast is, it's good to question things. It's good to question where things come from, which people created these stories or traditions, and why it was important to them and why it might not be important for you. Aspects of this might be important for you, aspects of it might not be. I think as teachers, it's important to evolve. Things evolve, things change. It's a good thing. We can't just repeat things like parrots dogmatically and thinking that we can't change things, and that in some way this is not authentic. Authenticity comes from being in line with what you practice and what you teach. That's authenticity, not just repeating something because someone else told you so. Maybe it's true, but we have to embody these practices fully as teachers so that when we teach it from our own rooms, it's authentic. I'm drawn to that massively. I would much rather a teacher modify things that they felt was in line with them so that they taught something from that space than someone just repeating a story that someone told them that they don't even know is really true, or worse, doesn't even really feel right for them, but they just do it anyway. I've got to admit, this is what I've seen a lot of in Ashtanga yoga, unfortunately, is people just repeating things based in a kind of parrot-like fashion without really embodying it and knowing whether it was really true themselves, or just, out of dogmatism, just repetition of statements and belief systems, that aren't really fully embodied themselves. I think that it's good to believe in something, and we can gain a lot of value from tradition and beliefs, but we have to be a little bit mindful of how we pass this on to our students. And again, a red flag for me is when that's done in a dogmatic way. If you go to your teacher and question something and they give you a very dogmatic response that doesn't really make sense, that's a red flag. And my experience in Ashtanga Yoga actually is I met a lot of that. I would ask certain questions to different teachers, and I would get met with anger, and shutting down conversation. To me, this has got nothing to do with yoga or truth or any real sense of good teaching qualities, to be honest. To me, this is just a dogmatic belief system. I've talked about this before in other episodes, so I won't go into that so much, but it's good to question things, and you should be able to have a two-way conversation with your teacher about things that might be or not be in line with you and your yoga practice. I would encourage this open discourse. I've said it before, pragmatism over dogmatism. What works in the real world, what actually works, rather than what I'm just going to tell you to do dogmatically. We should be pursuing truth and pragmatism, and pursuing the things that work in the real world. Again, all of these traditions are super nice, and all of these mythology and stories are very interesting, but they have to make sense. They have to work, and we can't just do things that don't feel right for us based on some tradition. Or really, what we're talking about is potentially one man's belief system. It's potentially a lot of this just comes from one man and his belief systems. It's good to question these things. These people aren't, I'm talking about Pattabhi Jois, for example. He isn't an infallible, perfect saint person. Of course he's not. No guru, none of these people are. I'm not. It's good to question things, This wasn't written by some godlike person and it's perfect. I'm not going to go into this again because I talked about this on other episodes, but it's good to be a bit critical, And again, if you're met with dogmatic responses, to me, it's a red flag. And this is why I stopped practicing in certain spaces, because of that kind of energy of dogmatism. And I'm talking about this a lot on my podcast because I think, like I say, why not? It's time. It's time for a bit of a shift, and it's a bit of a time to question things and to see what works in the real world and what is more beneficial to the students, rather than just sort of pushing some kind of dogmatism. Okay, I'll probably leave that one there. Ciao.